For decades, if there was a gangland execution, a major armed robbery, police corruption scandal, or unsolved murder anywhere in Britain, one name kept appearing at the centre of it all: Jeff Edwards. Known across Fleet Street and inside Scotland Yard as the murder guy, Jeff rose from local newspapers in East London during the violent aftermath of the Kray era to become arguably the most feared and respected crime reporter in the country. This is a man who didn't report crime from behind a desk or off social media. He lived it. From interviewing contract killers in prison cells, to walking into pubs controlled by armed gangsters, to uncovering stories many people in power desperately wanted buried. Jeff Edwards spent decades moving through Britain's criminal underworld at a time when London streets were ruled by fear, violence, corruption and silence. His new autobiography lifts the lid on a lost world of old school journalism and organised crime. A world of unsolved murders, extortion, blackmail, undercover operations abroad, bent coppers, hardened detectives and killers who vanished into the shadows. The book has already stormed into the national bestseller charts and is now sitting in airport bookshops across the country with major coverage from the BBC and Daily Mirror. Tonight, Jeff joins us to tell the stories behind the headlines, the stories Fleet Street could never fully print, and the truths that many people still won't want spoken about today. This is not a polished corporate interview. This is the real underworld of Britain, and Jeff Edwards lived through every bloody minute of it. Jeff, you've got a new book out.
Yes, Dave, thank you. It's my first attempt to write a book, but pleased to say it's doing really well, and it was a real pleasure to write it, actually, because I thought that in a way it's quite a tribute, I think, to the police in a sense, because I couldn't have done that without them.
Without policing.
And that's a 50-year history of knowing cops of all types and descriptions and getting them. I mean, I was so lucky. I grew up in East London. I went to work in East London. It was, you couldn't have asked for a better grounding. At that time, it was like working in Dodge City in the 1870s, right? Yeah. We got a murder a week. Yeah. There were all sorts of shootings and stabbings and goings on. And I found that if you were prepared to negotiate and be trustworthy and display some integrity and discretion, I was always amazed at what cops would tell you that you really weren't supposed to know. But one of the most flattering things that was ever said to me, Dave, was by a police detective one day. He said, "Jeff, you're as well known for what you don't write as what you do write." Because it's a world of strange arrangements. There's your smoke and mirrors. And I loved that intrigue, and you're quite right. Thanks for that very nice intro. I lived and breathed it, and it wasn't a job to me. It occurred to me later. It was my identity. It was my whole life, really. And even though I've been retired a few years now, which gave me the luxury of the time to get my head down and write that book, I'm still fascinated. I've got police in my family now. I've got a stepson, who's a police sergeant in a big force, and a daughter-in-law who's a detective. Yeah. And she reminds me, to a certain extent, although the world has changed radically, but she reminds me of the kind of officers I used to meet when they were young men and women in their 20s and 30s.
So that's the thing, isn't it? It's very, very different days now. Very different. I've got two boys in the job, and but they still love it. But they don't know how things were.
No.
And I think we lived in the golden age of policing.
I suspect we did. I mean, I think we all had a lot more latitude.
Yeah.
And I don't mean there was anything necessarily. Some people might interpret that as being a bit sinister. The fact that that I would say I had a trusting relationship with a lot of detective officers. Some people might interpret that as meaning, oh yeah, you did each other favours and nothing was spoken about, and there were bungs and backhanders going in and so forth. Actually, it's interesting, Dave. I never paid a policeman a penny for anything in my whole career. All right, I would take them out for a nice bit of grub one night. Sometimes I used to get complimentary tickets to football matches and things and take them, but they would normally reciprocate. A couple of weeks later, somebody would call me back and say, "Listen, I've got a couple of tickets, for for Stamford Bridge this week coming up. If you want to come with me as my guest, and that's the way it worked.
I think it all changed, didn't it, because of Leveson and all of that. And I think it was more about, at the ground level, at the coalface, detectives had to use the press. That's how you got information and how you could get stuff out of the public domain. But then it seemed to go up to senior levels, commissioner, assistant commissioners, and that's where it went wrong.
I would say that it started to go wrong a bit before that, actually, Dave. I think it actually went wrong in the 1990s when certain chief officers started to say things like, I've got a lot of corrupt officers on my books. And I actually had one particular character one day kind of, jab me in the chest and say to me, and the trouble is people like you, although he wasn't accusing me directly, but, colleagues of yours are paying my officers for these so-called exclusive, stories. Yeah. I'm not saying that wasn't happening in certain organisations, but right from the outset, I always thought that was a slippery slope to go down. But I think it started then, and the truth is, there were some problems in policing, but the way it was dealt with, I thought, was cack-handed and created huge resentment in all sorts of areas. And I thought that, and this is a topic we've discussed before, but I even think that the anti-corruption people, in many ways, in their own way, were almost as bad as the people that they were targeting, if not worse, frankly.
Well, let's start at the very beginning. So, how did you get into journalism? What was the route? What was you bringing up? How did you get up in?
It was an accident, really, Dave. I remember discussing it when I was at school with mates of mine, and we used to talk about what we were going to do when we left school, and becoming a journalist seemed as unobtainable as becoming a Concorde pilot in those days. But by a chapter of accidents, and it was, I met an old mate of mine who had gotten into a local paper in Walthamstow. He said to me, I think you'd be ideal for this game. Showed me basically how to write a letter of introduction. And so I wrote off to a few local papers in East London, where I happened to live at the time. And to my utter surprise and delight, I got offered a job as an apprentice reporter. I was 17 years of age, no university background. I know it's a cliche, but in fact it was on the job training. It was induction training. You learned by doing it. And because I was in East London, and in fact my kind of, as a teenage boy, that's what I was at that time, my aspiration was I really wanted to be a sports reporter. I was really into football, cricket, boxing, all the rest of it. But then of course you can't just go and do that. So, but then, quite quickly I was told, you're going to have to go into these police stations and get them to tell you everything that's been going on the last 7 days this week. And nobody gave me any instruction how to do that. I went in there and you get these, 30-year sergeants who get out a great big leather-bound serious crime book and go there, we've had a nasty post office robbery here. And I would simply say, who's the officer dealing with that? Because you'd only get a snapshot of a crime from what was written in that book. And they would say, it's Detective Sergeant so-and-so. And I just thought it was a courtesy. I mean, Dave, we're living in an era before computers and mobile phones. I'd go back to my office, ring the CID at West Ham and say, can I speak to DS so-and-so? And about 60% of the time they'd come on and say, listen, mate, I'll either drop in and see me or we'll be round, the Dog and Duck later on tonight. If you like a pint, come and join us. I did like a pint, so that was quite handy. There were people that wouldn't give you the time of day as well, but you had to work navigate your way around that. But then, of course, you go and actually meet these people and you say, listen, I'm really interested in your job. And I suppose that everybody likes somebody to be interested in what they do for work, don't they, And people would totally say, they would give you chapter and verse sometimes, stuff that really you shouldn't have been allowed to know, talking about, what really happened in this job, what they really thought about what had gone on, who might be involved, how it had happened, all that good stuff. But they would sometimes also, I learned very quickly to get around problems like, there were times when I had detectives say to me, got this really sensitive job going on at the moment, and I would say, who knows about this? Who's on this bit of work? And they would say, well, it's me and him and our governor, and that's it. And I say, listen, there's going to be ructions, aren't there? I don't want to put you in a position. I'd rather walk away from it. And that paid me dividends, over 40 years, in as much as there were people who, I would deal with who would say, listen, I can't talk to you about this particular matter now. And I would go away from there, and 10 years later, they might ring me up and say, you did me a favour 10 years ago, now let me do you one.
It comes down to trust.
And it comes down to trust. And I was not a particularly brilliant journalist, but what I did have was the ability to talk to people on their own terms and to respect their situations. I wasn't one of those reporters, or I learned quite quickly not to be one of those reporters that was going to rush off and put everything I've been told into print. You have to think about discretion and how is it going to impact you. You've got a career path as well you want to stay on, but that all stood me in good stead. And as I said, I like to think that I never ever did anything deliberate that caused anybody any problems. Every now and again there'd be little accidents, hiccups and whatever, but we always found a way. Sensible people, I think, can always come to an accommodation. We can always sit down and say, listen, no point in us having a row. Let's find a way to solve this. And that's that was, and your reputation precedes you. And as one of your former colleagues said to me, and I'll never forget it, it's such a good line, but he said to me, Gaff, he said, trust is like virginity. He said, you only lose it the once, don't you? And I knew exactly what he meant. In other words, I will tell you anything you want to know, but don't ever let it come back to my door if there's a problem. One of the funniest things that ever happened to me was when I was just a young 22-year-old reporter working in East London, and somebody said to me, Al, we've got a new detective inspector. He'd like to meet you. So I said, OK, that's fine. So, of course, the meet was laid on in a pub. Of course, all proper meetings were held on licensed premises in those days. This bloke said to me, he said, I've got a problem. I don't know if you can help me with it. And I said, what's that? He said, and I can even remember to this day the name of the bloke involved. He said, have you ever heard of a bloke called Carvel O'Brien? And I said, no. He said, he's ripping the arse out of our ground at the moment. He's a burglar. He's escaped from the Verne prison in Dorset. He's come onto our ground and he's done 28, domestics and 16 commercials, in the space of 3 weeks, and he's driving us mad. And I said, well, how do you know it's him? And he said, well, he doesn't care. His dabs are everywhere. And I said, just talking this through, I said, if I put his name in the paper and say, it's him, he's going to make himself scarce. He's going to clear off, isn't he? And this bloke looked at me straight and he went, that's right, he's going to clear off. In other words, he's going to stop bothering us. Anyway, so I wrote up the story in the paper and it came out, it wasn't front page, but it got a good show inside. This prison escaper, burglary rampage, Carl O'Brien, da-da-da-da-da. And the uniform governor from Forest Gate, it was, I can tell this now because this bloke's dead, called me up and he said, I need to see you. So I walked into his office and there he's got the paper, the local paper, the Newham Recorder open in front of him. And he smoked a pipe, and he's smoking his pipe and he pointed at the wife, so he went, I don't suppose you're going to tell me who told you about this, are you? So I said to him, no, I can't, that's a professional, my professional policy is I can't possibly talk to you. He said, you're a rascal, aren't you? Because he was, apparently he was a scoutmaster in his spare time, all the rest of it. And he said, I just want to caution you. He said, I have some very, 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 he said, worrying CID officers under my command. Very irresponsible, some of them are, But of course, what happened was, a couple of weeks later, DI from Leighton, which was a neighbouring police station, rang me up and he said, can I see you? I need to come over with you. And of course, this bloke O'Brien had just shifted like 5 miles sideways to another part of East London and was driving them mad. And to me, I mean, that's a story that's not in the book,
Yeah.
but you know, I've got loads and loads and loads of stories like that, where people have said to me quite earnestly over the years, you know, do you think you've ever been used by the police? And I say, yes, but they're all thinking at kind of like political level, you know, kind of like, but it's actually things like that where people would say, can you help us get rid of this bloke because you're not pain in the arse?
Yeah, just get the job done.
Yeah.
But I mean, East London, I mean, going back when you're 17 in East London, you report, I mean, East London was back then the sort of centre of.
I mean, it was. I mean,
town and
I started in 1967, in the summer of 1967, which was the summer of love. The Jimi Hendrix. I remember one Saturday night we all went to the Tottenham Royal with our mohair suits because we were all mods in those days. Yeah. And it was rubbish. So somebody said, there's a love-in going on tonight at Alexandra Palace. You know, we went up there and it was a hippie festival. And I remember it was just, you know, something to behold. But at the other side of that coin, so it was a summer of peace and love. But in East London, you know, Gangsters,
Krays.
Every pub was having, every pub, probably every cafe, greengrocers, fishmongers, were all having a way on to either, you know, because if you didn't, then somebody would walk in, Saturday night, someone would walk in and bottle several of your best customers, you know, and put them in hospital, and things like that would go on.
Yeah.
And of course, the Krays were notorious, and the Krays got all the publicity, but they weren't the only firm out there by any means. And of course, eventually they went to jail in 1969, and that left a vacuum. And there were 3 or 4 well established already by then criminal firms like Tibbs, Nichols, Jacobs. Some of them owned pubs outright in there, like Blundell's. You know, Eddie and Billy Blundell had minicab businesses. They ran Ice Cream Wars. I tell you what, at that time I had a mate. He was at university. He said to me one day, he said, I've got a job this summer working for some people called Blundell, driving an ice cream van. So I said, are you sure? So he said, yeah. So when do you start? He said, next week. So I saw him a couple of weeks later. I said, how's that job going? He said, I packed up after the first day. He said, they took me up to Westminster Abbey. And he said, when they took me over the vehicle and told me how to drive it and to operate it, he said, there was a baseball bat stuck down the side of the seat here, you see. And he said, I said to the bloke who's showing me around it, I said, well, what's that for? He said, oh, that's in case the van breaks down. You might need that. He said, it didn't make sense to me. But anyway, he said, first day we arrived outside Westminster Abbey and there's another ice cream van already there. He said, so this bloke who's like chaperoning me, he said, I don't know who he was. I just got introduced to him as Harry or whatever. Grabs the baseball bat, gets out, smashes all the windows of this other ice cream van, where of course the bloke then clears off at top speed, leaving the pitch, and said to me, right, it's over to you now, mate. I'm going back on the tube, back to East London. And he said, he left me there. So I thought, you know, if this is the way, you know, he's basically, we were outright gangster out of it. So there was all this going on. And of course, what happened was that they all tried to, you know, muscle in quite literally on mostly pubs, but other venues as well, all through, you know, what we call now the boroughs of Newham and Waltham Forest and Tower Hamlets and whatever. And there was fighting going on. You know, and I'm talking about serious stuff. When I'm talking about fighting, I'm talking about people turning up to places with and sawn off through letterboxes and all the rest of it. And I mean, it was fierce. And at that time, and this is in the book, Scotland Yard set up a special unit to kind of try and crack down on the gangs. And I don't like talking about police corruption, and I can see sometimes in this instance, for instance, it was a means to an end. But it was run by a man called Bert Wixted, who the newspapers celebrated. And in those days, Fleet Street used to give
Old Grey Fox
nicknames, you know, daring nicknames to the Charlie Artful and the Old Grey Fox and all the rest of it. And Wixted became known as the Old Grey Fox. Now, he wouldn't give me the time of day in those days because I was too far down the pecking order. But, you know, I knew people who either had known him before, and Wixted's, but, you know, stock in trade phrase in that period was, let's nick them now and we'll get some evidence later. You know,
I think those are the days. I think those are the days when you'd end up getting nicked out at the police station, and then as soon as the brief turned up at the front counter, you moved police stations. You moved to the next police station.
You moved in every 24 hours, so the brief could never find his client.
Yeah,
because there was no Police and Criminal Evidence Act in those days. It was all
Judges' rules.
Judges' rules, absolutely. And I remember, and this is in the book, one notorious incident. I can talk freely about this bloke now because he's dead. But there was an enforcer working with the Tibbs family called Billy Williams.
Met Django.
Django, or Billy the Bomb, some people
Bill
call
the
him.
Bomb, yeah. Died very strange circumstances. But yeah, go on.
Well, that's another topic. But he, one day, he was. Now, I don't know what the relationship was between him and Wixted, but this tells you a lot. So I'm working on the Newham recorder. I come into work one Monday morning. I ring up Forest Gate Police Station to speak to a mate of mine. Anything interesting over the weekend? He said, well, there was a bit of a to-do at the Courtney Hotel, which was at Manor Park. It was in a sort of parade of shops near what they call the Aldersbrook Estate. There was City of London cemeteries on one side.
Yeah.
There was a little place there called the Courtney Hotel, and it was a bit of a nightclub at weekends as well. He said, somebody attacked Billy Williams on the steps of... he said, do you know who Billy Williams is? And I said, yeah. He said, someone attacked him with a machete on the steps of the Courtney Hotel. Last night was a Sunday. And I said, he said, I've just come in myself. He said, I'm just looking at the night duty CID of an entry in. He's in East Ham Memorial Hospital. He said, they nearly decapitated him. He's got like 50 stitches in the back of his neck and all the rest of it. So I jumped in my car and I shot down at the Courtney Hotel, had a look, and I've seriously never seen so much congealing claret in all my life. There was buckets of it all over the back steps. Hotel was closed. There were really no neighbours that who would have seen anything. Came back to my office and I rang my mate again and I said, have you had a chance to speak to anybody? He said, listen, Jeff, he said, I don't know what's going on here. He said, Mr. Wixted came down about an hour after I last spoke to him. He said, he's torn the crime book entry about the assault on Williams out of the book and taken it away, stuck it in his pocket. So I said, well, what does that mean? He said, what that means is, he said, Jeff, he said, what all that claret you saw on the step up there, he said, must have been a nosebleed because there's no crime has been reported.
Yeah.
And then Williams went off to America and he was sent, I think, that his own people around him and probably Wixted wanted him out of the way, whether he saw him as a potential witness or whatever.
Informant, potentially.
Perhaps he was, who knows?
Yeah.
But he sent him out to Florida because he was a professional boxer to train in the Angelo Dundee stable, who was Muhammad Ali's trainer.
Yeah.
And apparently Williams then formed a relationship with a young woman, got her pregnant, decided that he didn't want to marry her, but she was the daughter of one of a New York mafia senior, made man.
Yeah.
And the message came back to him, you'd be better off being tied down with a wife and new baby than being tied up and dumped in the Everglades, mate, And he came back to Britain. And of course, a bit later on, I remember there was an extraordinary incident where only a couple of years later, he then gets nicked for attempted murder, where he and two other people had held down a bloke called Vaughan. And I think this was all about just kind of a little bit of kind of like family dispute business, and run him over 3 times with a Cortina estate car, which I have to make you laugh, but they were notoriously light at the back. People used to put a bag of cement in them because when it was wet, they would skid all over the place.
Yeah.
And, so this bloke just got like 3 sets of groundhog marks all across his chest and a few broken ribs and everything, but he survived it. But Williams got a big portion of Burden for attempted murder. And a bit later on, as my life progressed and his did, I several times, I used to go to visit people in prison and so forth. And I do remember quite late in my career, he was in Pentonville for some drugs offence. But these people, they lived by it, they died by it. And there were all sorts of characters.
He was sort of one of those villains who wasn't part of a group or a gang, was he? He was a
Well, he was very associated with the Tibbs.
yeah, but he was an individual. Yeah, around East London at that time.
Yeah.
Kennington, you had that, but then you start to see the formation of proper organised crime gangs.
Oh yeah,
families.
Yeah. I mean, I think things got more sophisticated. You can't extrapolate, or you have to extrapolate from this, the fact that quite a lot of people who were involved in organised crime were armed robbers.
Yeah.
Because armed robbery was a proper recognised occupation.
Yeah.
In places like Southwark,
Yeah.
you could get your city of girls in it.
South
Yeah, Southwark, but also Canning Town
Yeah.
and all those good places like that. And of course, what I saw, it was the change in criminal behaviour, particularly organised crime, which you would have seen, of course, from the kind of 1980s on.
So you had the sort of the. It's actually interesting because it's in the book Judas Pig,
which I've read.
Featuring Horace Silver, with Jimmy Holmes.
Yes.
And he talks about that sort of change from the 70s, 60s, 70s armed robber suddenly to the 80s and the cocaine trade taking over.
Absolutely.
Organised crime.
Yeah. And you can see the rationale behind it. You did a big armed robbery, you took that money, you invested it in cannabis or cocaine or whatever, and first of all, was far less chance of you being shot dead in a flying squad ready eye when you were going across the pavement with the gun in the armed robbery in the first place. Second, if you do get captured, the sentences were less, profits were bigger, for less effort, arguably.
Yeah.
Everything was a better deal, wasn't it? Than actually.
Well, that was the thing. At the end of the day, if you got to remember as well. I mean, this is what look back at the success of policing back then. You had the flying squad was set up really to tackle armed robberies. They brought in the regional crime squad.
Correct.
And you had a clear out rate, I think, somewhere in the region of 40-50%. Almost half of every armed robbery or robberies were cleared up. Were caught, and they were caught on the pavement doing robberies. It was the days of informants, and I think you're absolutely right. It sort of moved away from those days of armed robbery into an easier, more profitable, less risk, higher reward,
bigger rewards. What's not the like about getting into drugs as opposed to armed robbery, really? And of course, coinciding with that, armed robbery became more difficult anyway, because first of all, in the 70s, we used to say in my office, Thursday, dry day, robbery day.
Yeah.
Why? Because Thursdays was wages days, and most people got paid in cash on a Thursday in those days. And then they took their money, went to the supermarket, spent it there. The supermarkets had to take big bags of cash back to the bank. The money was literally going round like that, offering armed robbers all these opportunities to steal big bags of money.
Yeah.
But gradually, as we moved into an electronic age, where we all had credit cards to pay for things instead of ready money, and everything was done on an electronic transfer, the opportunities were less, and the technology, all the vans suddenly became tracked, and cunning little devices, dye, smoke, all sorts of things were tried, weren't they? Glue, and it suddenly became less of an attractive.
And they moved. You tended to find, I think, in that sort of intervening period, what you saw as well. I recall seeing was the sort of the move towards cocaine. It was always cannabis, a bit of LSD, a bit of amphetamine, but the move towards particularly cocaine sort of followed the Americans, and suddenly cocaine became the drug of choice, and then you saw the various crime groups vying for position. And
another thing that I thought was really interesting, and I think it was one of your colleagues from the regional crime squad who one day pointed it out to me, that in the 90s and into the first part of the 21st century, this country went from being a bulk importer of cannabis to actually basically cultivating almost everything itself right here.
Absolutely.
Because hydroponics became easily available. People, it wasn't too difficult to set up a growery. And so that happened. But as you say, different drugs have different. They begin in different ways. We saw, for instance, the MDMA, ecstasy type.
Late 80s.
Bloom in the 80s, alongside the
80s.
house parties, acid house, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then you saw cocaine, which had been comparatively rare and much more expensive, become like everything else. Once there's loads of it, the price comes down.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I grew up in an age. I remember meeting when I was 17, I think, even before I started my job, the first bloke I ever knew in the Woodford area who'd been to prison, and he was a local drug dealer, and all that he would sell in those days was what they called French blues or purple hearts, which was amphetamine sulfate speed.
Yeah.
And there was a little bit of cannabis available in the 1960s. That's all you could get, really.
Yeah.
And then people started to be able to get more creative and inventive with. There was always heroin was always considered, I think, by people I knew to be bad news, although there was a dirty drug, although there was a market for it, and we also have seen, with a changing face of Britain, the transition about how certain ethnic groupings, right up to now, I'm told that it's mostly Albanians who've got the cocaine trade.
Yeah, Albanians, absolutely.
We saw, the Turks in North London particularly take control of the heroin trade. I don't know whether that's because the transport routes from the kind of heroin fields of Asia were through Turkey, through Istanbul and everything. That's how they got involved as facilitators initially, and then probably as large-scale purchasers, and so forth. So, and this is what we're talking about here is why my life was always so interesting, because all of these things, everything that when you were a policeman, you had to deal with, was what I had to do.
You're sitting on the outside looking at all this unfold.
Yeah. So I'm living, you were actually doing it. You were actually intercepting people and getting hands on the bad people and everything. I was living a bit vicariously, although I did, from time to time get taken out on interesting jobs and, so there was never a dull day as far as I was concerned.
So when did you go from sort of East London? Was it New Recorder?
Yeah, I worked a couple of places in East London. I worked on the New Recorder, the Stratford Express.
Right.
None of these things exist anymore. We were in Stratford Broadway. Opposite our pub was the Yorkshire Grey. I'm not even sure that's still there in Stratford Broadway.
Yeah.
And then I went in the early mid-1970s to the London Evening News, which was a much different kind of. It was a real step up in every sense.
Yeah, the news and the Standard, because I used to sell them outside the station when I was a kid.
Well, there you go. I mean, when I was a kid, and I used to go down to meet my dad off the tube sometimes at South Woodford Station when we lived in the 50s. There were 3 London evening papers. There was a Star News and Standard, and the old paper seller standing out there would shout, Star News and Standard.
Yeah, I did all that. Yeah,
5 or 6 editions
8 pence, a day. 8 pence each. I used to get 2p.
Yeah. And I think, was it the Evening News that on a Saturday we used to do a pink football results edition?
Yes.
I've never quite understood why they changed the colour of the print, because it must have been, expensive to do that, but they did that. But so anyway, there was a thriving evening paper market, and the Standard was considered to be a bit posh. The Standard's kind of sales base was more kind of Maida Vale, Pimlico, Chelsea, Mayfair. Ours, we wrote more about we like East London, South London, all the kind of traditional working class hearts of London, and so I went to work there in end of 1974, and it was a really steep learning curve.